You know that moment when you realize your entire life has been built on a lie, when everything you thought you knew crumbles in an instant, and you're left standing in the wreckage, wondering how you could have been so blind. Well, I'm about to tell you about the day I discovered that 13 years of sacrifice, love, and devotion led to the most humiliating moment of my life, followed by the most incredible surprise I never saw coming. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning because the beginning explains everything. It was a Tuesday morning in March, one of those gray, drizzling days that seep into your bones and make you question every life choice you've ever made. I was standing in Margaret's kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made her breakfast every single morning for the past 13 years, staring at her empty chair. The silence was deafening. No more labored breathing echoing from the living room. No more shuffle of worn slippers against hardwood floors. No more confused calls of, "Elena? Elena, where are you?" Margaret wasn't my mother. She wasn't even technically family anymore. She was my ex-mother-in-law, a title that never felt right rolling off my tongue. When David and I divorced 8 years ago, everyone expected me to disappear from Margaret's life, cut clean ties, move on, start fresh. Hell, his 4 siblings, Michael, Sarah, Jennifer, and Thomas, made it crystal clear that's exactly what they wanted. "You don't owe her anything," Sarah had said during one of our increasingly heated phone conversations, her voice sharp with barely concealed irritation. "The divorce papers are signed. You're not family anymore. Time to move on with your life." Gee, but here's the thing about love, real love. The kind that grows slowly over years of shared morning coffees and quiet Sunday afternoons. It doesn't disappear just because lawyers say it should. And when the doctor sat us all down in that sterile hospital room with its fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell, explaining that Margaret couldn't live alone anymore, something inside me couldn't just walk away. "Early-stage dementia," Dr. Rodriguez had said, his voice gentle but clinical. "She'll need daily check-ins, help with medications, assistance with meals. Someone needs to be present consistently." I watched Margaret's 5 children exchange glances across that hospital room. Michael was already pulling out his phone, probably calculating billable hours. Sarah was tapping her manicured nails against her designer purse, her mind clearly elsewhere. Jennifer kept checking her watch. Soccer practice, piano lessons, PTA meetings waiting. Thomas was staring out the window like he was planning his escape route. And David? My ex-husband couldn't even look at me, his jaw tight with the uncomfortable reality that his former wife was about to volunteer for something he couldn't bring himself to do. Margaret had looked at me with those tired, hopeful eyes that reminded me so much of David when he was worried about something. Her hands were shaking slightly. Whether from fear or the beginnings of her condition, I couldn't tell. "I can't ask this of you, Elena," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of hospital machinery. "You have your own life to live. You and David. That chapter is closed." "You're not asking," I'd replied, reaching over to squeeze her trembling hand. "I'm offering." The look David gave me across that room was complex. Gratitude mixed with guilt. Relief tangled with resentment. He knew, as we all did, that none of Margaret's biological children were in a position to provide the care she needed. But accepting help from his ex-wife made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. That was 13 years ago. 13 years of 6 a.m. medication schedules and afternoon walks around the neighborhood. 13 years of doctor appointments in waiting rooms that always smelled like disinfectant and despair. 13 years of grocery shopping for foods that would tempt an increasingly finicky appetite. 13 years of watching a brilliant, vibrant woman, a former high school principal who could recite Shakespeare from memory and solve crossword puzzles in ink, slowly fade away while her own children, including my ex-husband, lived their important, busy lives across the country. Don't get me wrong, they visited. Christmas, Easter, sometimes a random weekend, when guilt apparently got the better of them. They'd sweep into Margaret's house like visiting dignitaries, bringing expensive flowers that would wilt within days and awkward hugs that lasted exactly the socially appropriate amount of time. They'd stay for a few hours, maybe take some photos to post on social media, proving they were good children, then disappear back to their real lives. Michael had his thriving law practice in Chicago, specializing in corporate mergers that apparently required his attention 24/7. Sarah was climbing the corporate ladder in Denver, some high-powered marketing position that involved constant travel and networking events. Jennifer was busy raising her 3 kids in Phoenix, soccer games, school plays, the kind of full family life that left no room for elderly mothers with failing minds. Thomas was finding himself in various cities across the country, funded by a trust fund that seemed to never run dry and a series of artistic pursuits that never quite panned out. And David had remarried within 2 years of our divorce, a younger woman named Rebecca who worked in his dental practice and was now living in Seattle, busy building the family life we'd never quite managed to create together. Meanwhile, I was there, every single day. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's new wife got the version of him I'd always wanted, attentive, present, committed to building something together, while I'd been left to care for the mother he couldn't find time to visit more than twice a year. "It's not that I don't appreciate what you're doing," David had said during one of his rare visits, his voice carefully neutral in that way he'd perfected during our marriage counseling sessions. "It's just complicated. Rebecca doesn't really understand why you're still so involved with our family." "Your family," I'd corrected him. "And I'm involved because someone has to be." He'd looked uncomfortable then, shifting his weight from foot to foot, like he used to do when we argued about his long work hours or his mother's subtle criticisms of me during our marriage. Mom seemed stable. Maybe it's time to think about professional care. There are some excellent facilities. Your mother doesn't want to be in a facility, I'd interrupted. She wants to be in her own home, surrounded by familiar things, with people who actually know her. People who know her, he'd repeated, and I caught the emphasis he placed on the word people. As if caring for his mother was some kind of elaborate performance I was putting on, rather than genuine love. I was there when Margaret forgot how to use the television remote, spending patient hours showing her which button turned it on, which changed channels, which controlled the volume. The same lesson, over and over, until she'd look at me with frustrated tears in her eyes and say, "I used to be smart, Elena. I used to run a whole school. Now I can't even remember how to watch the news." I was there when she got lost walking back from the mailbox, a journey she'd made thousands of times in her 40-year residence on Maple Street. I spent that entire night walking the neighborhood in my pajamas and rain boots, calling her name, until I found her sitting on Mrs. Patterson's porch at 2 a.m., confused and shivering, unable to remember her own address, but somehow knowing my face meant safety. I was there when she stopped recognizing the mailman who'd delivered to her house for 15 years. Then the grocery store cashier, who always asked about her garden. Then the neighbors who'd been friends for decades. And eventually, on the hardest days, she'd look at me with polite confusion and ask, "I'm sorry, dear, but who are you again?" Those moments nearly destroyed me. After years of being her primary companion, confidant, and caregiver, watching her struggle to place my face was like dying a little bit every day. Sometimes I'd show her photos of David and me from our wedding day, hoping to jog her memory about our connection. "Oh, what a lovely couple," she'd say, studying the picture with genuine interest. Do I know them? But there were beautiful moments, too. Unexpected gifts hidden between the confusion and frustration. Like the afternoon, she suddenly remembered a story about David's first day of kindergarten, how he'd hidden under his bed because he was afraid of the other children, and her eyes would light up with perfect clarity as she described coaxing him out with promises of chocolate chip cookies and a special lunch packed with his favorite sandwich. He was such a sensitive little boy, she'd say, her voice warm with maternal love, always worried about disappointing people. I used to tell him that the bravest thing you can do is try something even when you're scared. Or the mornings when she'd hum old songs while I braided her silver hair, melodies from the 1940s that her own mother had sung to her, songs about love and loss and hope that seemed to come from some deep well of memory that the disease couldn't quite reach. In those moments, the fog would lift completely, and I'd glimpse the woman she'd been before her mind began betraying her. "You have such gentle hands," she'd say, closing her eyes as I worked the brush through her hair. "Just like a daughter would. I always wanted a daughter." The comment stung every time, partly because Margaret had actually raised 2 daughters, Sarah and Jennifer, who rarely called and visited even less frequently, but also because during my marriage to David, Margaret and I had talked many times about the grandchildren we both hoped would come someday, the little girls I might give her to spoil and love. Those grandchildren never came. David and I had tried for years before admitting that timing, stress, and ultimately incompatibility had made parenthood impossible for us. By the time we divorced, Margaret was already beginning to show early signs of cognitive decline, and the grandchildren she dreamed of felt like just another loss in a series of disappointments. "You would have been such a good mother," she'd told me during one of her clearer moments, maybe 3 years ago. "I'm sorry David couldn't see what he had in you." Those words sustained me through everything. Even when her actual children called with thinly veiled criticism about how I was handling her care. "Are you sure you're not being a little overprotective?" Jennifer had asked during one of our monthly phone conversations. "Mom sounds so dependent when I talk to her. Maybe she'd be more independent if she had to manage more things on her own." Easy to say when you lived 200 miles away and visited twice a year. The last 2 years were brutal. Margaret required round-the-clock supervision, and I'd moved into David's old bedroom, the same room where he'd slept as a teenager, with its blue plaid wallpaper and model airplanes still hanging from the ceiling. Sleeping in my ex-husband's childhood bed while caring for his mother felt surreal, but Margaret found comfort in having someone in the house at night. My own apartment sat empty across town, accumulating dust and past due notices, while I essentially surrendered my independent life. I'd had to leave my position at Morrison & Associates, where I'd been working as a senior bookkeeper with dreams of eventually getting my CPA certification. The partners were understanding at first. "Family emergencies," they said. "Take all the time you need." But all the time I needed stretched into months, then years, and eventually my position was quietly filled by someone who could actually show up to work consistently. My savings dwindled rapidly. Margaret insisted on giving me a small stipend for my care, $800 a month that barely covered groceries and gas, let alone my own living expenses. My credit cards crept toward their limits. My car needed repairs I couldn't afford. My social life disappeared entirely, partly from lack of time, and partly because it's hard to explain to friends why you're spending your 40s changing adult diapers and managing medication schedules instead of dating or traveling or pursuing any of the dreams you'd put on hold. "You're throwing your life away," my sister Emma would say during our weekly phone calls, her voice a mixture of concern and exasperation. "You're only 42, Elena. You could still meet someone, get married, have kids of your own. Mom didn't raise you to be a martyr." "Someone has to take care of her," I'd reply. But even I could hear how hollow the words sounded after years of repetition. Someone, yes. But why does it have to be you? Her own children should be handling this. Especially David. She's his mother, for God's sake. But David had made his choice clear years ago when he'd suggested professional care and moved across the country with his new wife. His brothers and sisters had made their choices too, with their busy careers and important lives that left no room for aging mothers who needed constant attention. Margaret had become more than an obligation to me, though. She was the mother figure I'd never really had growing up. Our own mother had died when I was 19, leaving Emma and me to figure out adulthood on our own. Margaret had filled that void when I married David, teaching me family recipes and holiday traditions, showing me photos of his childhood and sharing stories that made him seem more human, more lovable. I was so worried David would never find the right girl. She'd confided in me during our early years of marriage. He was always so focused on work, so serious all the time. But you brought out this lighter side of him. You made him laugh. Even as her mind slipped away, she'd still reach for my hand during thunderstorms, still smile when I brought her tea in her favorite cup, the delicate china one with painted roses that had been her wedding gift from her own mother. On the rare days when the fog lifted, she'd still call me her girl and ask about my plans for the future, as if I still had control over such things. Her children saw our relationship differently, of course. To them, I was hired help who'd gotten too attached to the job. Or worse, someone with ulterior motives. "She's taking advantage of your guilt," Sarah had said to David during one family phone call that I'd accidentally overheard. Why else would Elena give up her whole life to take care of Mom? There has to be something in it for her. Like what? David had asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely dismissing his sister's suspicions. I don't know. Maybe she thinks Mom will leave her something substantial. Maybe she's positioning herself as the perfect daughter-in-law in case you change your mind about the divorce. The suggestion that I was caring for Margaret out of some calculated self-interest rather than genuine love felt like a knife between my ribs. But it also explained the subtle coldness I'd noticed from David's siblings over the years, the way they'd grown increasingly uncomfortable with my continued presence in their mother's life. "Mom doesn't even remember who you are half the time," Michael had said during one of his infrequent visits, his expensive suit wrinkled from the flight, his attention already drifting to the phone calls he needed to return. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" "Because someone has to," I'd replied. But he was already walking away, too busy to hear my answer or engage with the implications of what I'd said. The truth was more complicated than that, though. I was doing it because Margaret had been there for me during my divorce, when David's emotional distance had finally become too much to bear. While her son was busy avoiding difficult conversations and making excuses for his inability to connect, Margaret had held me while I cried and told me I deserved someone who could love me completely. She'd helped me find my first apartment as a single woman and co-signed the lease when my credit wasn't quite good enough on its own. She'd shown me that not all family loyalty was conditional, that sometimes the people who choose to love you are more reliable than the ones who are supposed to love you automatically. So when she needed someone to show her that same unconditional love, how could I walk away? The end came suddenly, the way it often does with elderly people. Margaret had seemed stable as someone with advanced dementia can be. And then one morning, I found her unconscious in her bed, her breathing shallow and irregular. The paramedics were kind but realistic. "Massive stroke," they explained. Even if she survived, there would be no recovery, no more moments of clarity, no more recognition of familiar faces. She died 3 days later in the hospital, with me holding one hand and David holding the other, both of us crying for different reasons. His siblings arrived for the final hours, filling the small hospital room with their grief and guilt and complicated feelings about the mother they'd loved but hadn't been able to care for. "Thank you," David had said to me as we stood beside her bed after the machines had been turned off. "I know this wasn't easy, and I know we haven't always. I just want you to know how grateful we all are." His gratitude felt genuine but distant, like a thank you note sent to acknowledge a gift from someone you barely know. The funeral was small but dignified. Margaret had planned it years earlier, back when her mind was still sharp enough to make such decisions. She'd chosen the flowers, white roses, her favorites, and the music, including a hymn I'd never heard before, but that made the elderly ladies in attendance dab at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs. Her children delivered beautiful eulogies. Michael spoke about his mother's strength and wisdom, painting pictures of family camping trips and her legendary Sunday dinners. Sarah shared memories of learning to drive in Margaret's old Buick and getting advice about boys and career choices. Jennifer talked about how her own children had adored their grandmother's stories and homemade cookies. Thomas, in a rare display of eloquence, read a poem about the permanent impact of a mother's love. Even David spoke, his voice breaking slightly as he described Margaret's unwavering support during his difficult teenage years and her joy when he'd finally found his calling in dentistry. I sat in the back row, listening to these beautiful narratives and feeling like I was observing strangers. Where were these devoted children when Margaret couldn't remember how to tie her shoes? Where was this deep appreciation when she needed help remembering their names? Where were these cherished family memories when she was calling out for someone, anyone, to sit with her during the long, confusing afternoons? After the service, people approached me with genuine sympathy and gratitude that felt both warming and heartbreaking. "You were such a blessing to Margaret," said her longtime neighbor, Mrs. Chen, gripping my hands with surprising strength. "She talked about you constantly in those early days, before things got so difficult. She called you her angel, said you were the daughter she'd always prayed for." "I don't know how her family can ever repay you," added Ruth, Margaret's former hairdresser, who'd continued doing house calls even when Margaret could no longer hold a conversation. "What you did for that woman? It was extraordinary. Not many people would have made that sacrifice, especially after a divorce. You're a saint." But Margaret's children seemed eager to wrap things up and get back to their real lives. There was practical talk about selling the house, settling the estate, dividing assets. I understood their urgency. Grief affects everyone differently, and they had their own families and responsibilities waiting for them. "We'll need to move quickly on the house sale," Michael explained to his siblings over coffee in Margaret's kitchen after the funeral guests had left. "The market is good right now, and there's no point letting it sit empty." "What about Mom's things?" Jennifer asked, glancing around at the accumulated possessions of 78 years of life. "Some of these antiques might be valuable." "We'll hire an estate sale company," Sarah said briskly, scrolling through her phone. "I know a good one in Denver. They'll handle everything, give us fair market value for anything worthwhile." David sat quietly through these discussions, occasionally nodding but not contributing much to the planning. I wondered if he was thinking about all the weekends he'd spent in this house as a child, all the memories being reduced to market valuations and efficient disposal methods. I listened to them make these plans with detached interest, genuinely relieved that they were taking charge. I'd been making decisions about Margaret's daily life for so long that the thought of not being responsible for anything felt almost liberating. The reading of Margaret's will was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the offices of Peterson and Associates, the law firm that had handled her legal affairs for over 30 years. I wasn't expecting to be included. Why would I be? But apparently Margaret had left specific instructions that I be present for the proceedings. "Probably just wants to thank you formally in front of everyone," Michael had said with what I thought was a genuine smile. "You know how Mom was about proper etiquette and doing things the right way." Peterson and Associates occupied the top floor of one of the city's older professional buildings, the kind of place where serious business had been conducted for generations. The offices smelled like leather-bound books and expensive cologne, with dark wood paneling and oil paintings of stern-looking men in judicial robes. Mr. Peterson himself was a gentleman in his 70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of old-fashioned courtesy that was becoming increasingly rare. "Margaret spoke of you often," he said to me, as we waited for the others to arrive, his voice warm with genuine affection. "She was very grateful for your devotion to her care. She said you were the closest thing to a daughter she'd ever had." The 5 siblings arrived together, having coordinated their flights to minimize time away from their respective lives. They seemed relaxed, even cheerful. The difficult business of the funeral was behind them, and now they could settle Margaret's affairs and move forward with their inheritances. "Margaret was very specific about her final wishes," Mr. Peterson began, once we were all seated around his mahogany conference table. "She updated her will several times over the years, but the most recent revision was made 18 months ago, during a period when her cognitive function was still quite clear." 18 months ago. That would have been during one of Margaret's better periods, when the new medication was still helping, and she could hold complete conversations, even make complex decisions. Her estate is more substantial than some of you might realize. the lawyer continued, opening a thick folder. In addition to the house and its contents, she had several investment accounts, a life insurance policy, and some family heirlooms that have appreciated considerably in value over the years. The numbers were impressive, much more than I'd realized. The house alone was valued at just over $400,000, and there were investment portfolios, savings accounts, and insurance policies that brought the total estate to nearly $1.2 million. For children who'd been struggling with various financial pressures, this represented life-changing money. Mr. Peterson read through the bequests methodically. Michael, as the eldest son, inherited the house and primary residence, along with its contents, except for specific items designated for his siblings. Sarah received the largest investment portfolio, a mixture of stocks and bonds that had been carefully managed over decades. Jennifer inherited the life insurance policy and Margaret's savings accounts, enough to secure her children's college educations and then some. Thomas, despite his reputation for financial irresponsibility, was left Margaret's collection of antique furniture and artwork, pieces that had been accumulating value for generations. And David? David received Margaret's retirement accounts and a substantial cash inheritance that would allow him to expand his dental practice, or maybe finally take that European vacation he'd always talked about during our marriage. I listened to these allocations with genuine happiness for them. Margaret had been a thoughtful woman who'd planned carefully for her children's futures. The fact that they'd receive financial security from their mother's legacy seemed perfectly appropriate, even beautiful. Then Mr. Peterson cleared his throat and looked directly at me. For Elena Martinez, he read, his voice taking on a more formal tone, who gave 13 years of her life to care for me when my own children were too busy living theirs, who stayed when others left, who loved me when I could no longer remember how to love myself. I leave my most precious possession. She will understand its true value when the time is right. The room fell completely silent. I could hear the tick of an antique clock on the mantel, the distant hum of traffic from the street below, the sound of my own heart beating in my ears. Mr. Peterson reached into a small velvet bag and carefully extracted an ornate music box about the size of a jewelry box, with intricate carved flowers decorating its dark wooden surface. The brass hinges were tarnished with age, and I could see that the velvet lining inside was faded but still elegant. I recognized it immediately. Margaret had kept this music box on her bedroom dresser for as long as I'd known her. Sometimes, during her difficult days, when confusion and agitation made her inconsolable, I'd wind up the mechanism and let the gentle melody calm her down. She'd close her eyes and sway slightly to the tune, and for those precious few minutes, the fear would fade from her face. That's it. Sarah's voice cut through the silence like a knife, sharp with disbelief and barely contained anger. A music box? It was our great-grandmother's, Jennifer added, her tone suggesting I was somehow stealing a family heirloom. It should stay in the family. I am family, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt as I accepted the music box from Mr. Peterson. It was heavier than I'd expected, and something seemed to shift inside when I moved it. Probably a loose piece of the mechanism. Michael laughed, but there was nothing pleasant about the sound. It was the kind of laugh that's meant to wound, to diminish, to put someone in their place. 13 years, he said, shaking his head in apparent amazement. 13 years of your life, and she leaves you a broken toy. I guess that tells us what Mom really thought of all your dedication. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, a combination of embarrassment and anger that made my hands tremble slightly as I clutched the music box. David was staring at his hands, his face flushed with what might have been shame. He said nothing in my defense. Maybe she was losing her mind more than we realized, Thomas said, and I could hear the cruel amusement in his voice. I mean, who leaves their caregiver a music box instead of, actual money? Actually, Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone she probably used in boardroom presentations. Maybe we should contest this. I mean, undue influence and all that. Elena was the only one around Mom those last few years. Who knows what kind of pressure she might have applied to get herself written into the will. The suggestion hung in the air like poison gas. Contest the will. Accuse me of manipulating their vulnerable mother. Turn 13 years of genuine love and sacrifice into something ugly and mercenary. That's enough, Mr. Peterson said firmly. But I was already standing, clutching the music box against my chest like armor. Keep it, Sarah called after me as I walked toward the door, her voice following me into the hallway. Consider it payment for services rendered, though honestly, minimum wage for 13 years would have been more generous. Elena, wait! David started to say, but I was already through the door. I heard them laughing as the door closed behind me. Cruel, bitter laughter that echoed in the marble hallway and followed me into the elevator. By the time I reached the parking garage, I was crying. Not from hurt exactly, but from a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to reach into my very soul. The drive home took 20 minutes through city traffic, 20 minutes of processing what had just happened. 13 years reduced to a music box and mockery. 13 years of putting Margaret's needs before my own, of sacrificing my career, my social life, my chance at love and family, and this was how her children saw it. Payment for services rendered. Even David, who knew better than anyone what I'd given up, had sat there in silence while his siblings mocked me. My apartment felt smaller than usual when I finally unlocked the door. I'd been living there for only 3 weeks since Margaret's death, and it still didn't feel like home. The furniture was mismatched, gathered hastily from discount stores and estate sales. The walls were bare except for a few photos of Margaret and me from happier times. Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, quiet afternoons in her garden. For 13 years, home had been Margaret's house, with its familiar rhythms and routines. Home had been her needs, her schedule, her small daily victories and defeats. Now I was 42 years old with a modest savings account that wouldn't last more than 3 months, no job prospects that seemed realistic, and a music box that had somehow become the sum total of my entire adult life. I set the music box on my kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Despite everything that had just happened, I had to admit it was beautiful. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with delicate roses and trailing vines carved into the rich, dark wood. When I wound the small brass key on the bottom, it played a haunting melody I'd heard hundreds of times but never been able to identify. The ballerina inside was tiny and perfect, her pink tutu faded with age, but still graceful as she spun slowly on her miniature stage. Margaret had told me once that her grandmother had given her this music box when she was 7 years old, shortly after her own mother died. Grandma said it would always bring me comfort when I needed it most, Margaret had confided during one of her clearer moments, maybe 2 years ago. She said the music could chase away the loneliness better than anything else in the world. I played the melody 3 more times, letting the familiar tune fill my small, sad apartment. The sound was bittersweet, beautiful but melancholy, like a lullaby for someone who would never feel truly safe again. As I was winding it up for what I thought would be the last time that evening, something felt different. The mechanism seemed to resist slightly, as if there was more weight inside than there should be. I examined the box more carefully, running my fingers along the edges of the velvet-lined interior. There, along the bottom edge of the lining, I felt a slight ridge, almost imperceptible unless you were specifically looking for it. My heart began to race as possibilities flashed through my mind. Could there be a false bottom? I found a small pair of scissors in my kitchen drawer and carefully, reverently, lifted the edge of the aged velvet lining. Underneath was a thin wooden panel, and when I pressed gently along its edges, it shifted slightly. With trembling fingers, I managed to lift the false bottom. Nestled in a custom-cut foam insert were 2 rings that caught the light like captured fire, a pair of delicate gold necklaces that seemed to shimmer with their own inner warmth, and what could only be described as the most spectacular diamond necklace I had ever seen outside of a museum. But more than the jewelry, much more important than any precious stones, there was a folded piece of cream-colored paper, expensive stationery that felt substantial between my fingers. I unfolded Margaret's letter with hands that shook so badly I could barely manage the task, and began to read her final message to me. I unfolded Margaret's letter with hands that shook so badly I could barely manage the task. The cream-colored paper was expensive, the kind she'd always used for important correspondence, and her handwriting was careful and deliberate, written during one of her clearer periods when she could still form complete thoughts and plan for the future. My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, then I'm gone, and my music box has found its way to you as planned. I can only imagine how my children behaved during the reading of the will. I know them well enough to predict their cruelty, their disappointment that you received anything at all. Please forgive them. They are good people who have forgotten how to see beyond their own immediate needs. These pieces you've discovered belong to my grandmother and my great-grandmother before her. They are not just jewelry, they are history, legacy, love made tangible. The diamond necklace alone is worth more than my house, but its true value lies in what it represents. The strength of women who cared for their families above all else, who sacrificed without expectation of reward. 2 years ago, when my mind was still clear enough to make such decisions, I had these pieces appraised by a gentleman in Chicago who specializes in estate jewelry. Mr. Goldman was very thorough, very discreet. Together, these pieces are worth approximately $1.2 million. The emerald ring belonged to my great-grandmother, a wedding gift from her husband who made his fortune in railroads. The ruby ring was my grandmother's engagement ring. The diamond necklace was commissioned for my grandmother's 25th wedding anniversary. The golden necklaces were christening gifts from my own birth. I never told my children about these pieces because I knew they would see only the monetary value. You, my dear girl, will understand their true worth. I have watched you for 13 years, Elena. I have seen you sacrifice your own dreams, your own future, your own chance at happiness, all for an old woman whose mind was failing. Even when I could no longer remember your name, some part of me always knew you were safe, that you were love in human form. David was my son, and I loved him as mothers love their children, completely and without conditions. But he was never worthy of you. He was selfish in the way men can be selfish, thinking his work more important than relationships, believing his needs came before everyone else's. When he let you go, when he chose that younger woman over the treasure he already had, I knew he'd made the greatest mistake of his life. But his loss became my gain, because it meant you stayed with me. Use this gift wisely, my darling. Start the life you put on hold for me. Find love if you can. Real love this time, with someone who sees your worth. Travel to all the places we talked about visiting together. Buy a home with a garden where you can grow those vegetables you're always fussing over. Start a business. Help other families navigate what we've been through. Do whatever makes your heart sing. But please, do it quietly. My children chose their paths long ago, and I chose mine when I decided to reward faithfulness over biology. They will contest this if they discover what you've inherited, and I don't want your remaining years consumed by legal battles. Be smart. Be careful. Be happy. You were the daughter of my heart, Elena. In my clearest moments and my most confused ones, you were there. You saw me, really saw me when I was disappearing from myself. You treated me with dignity when I could no longer remember my own name. That kind of love is rarer than any diamond. I used to lie awake at night during those last months, when the confusion was overwhelming, and listen to you moving around the house, making tea, folding laundry, reading in the next room. The sound of your presence was better than any medication they could give me. You made my dying bearable, Elena. You gave me peace. Be happy, my darling girl. You have earned it 1,000 times over. All my love and eternal gratitude, Margaret P.S. The diamond necklace has a tiny inscription on the clasp. For those who love without condition. I think great-grandmother would approve of its new owner. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated my shock and grief. $1.2 million, hidden in a music box that her children had dismissed as worthless junk. Margaret had known exactly what would happen at the will reading. She'd anticipated their mockery, their cruelty, their complete inability to see past their own disappointment. And she'd found a way to give me not just financial security, but validation of everything I'd sacrificed. You were the daughter of my heart. Those words meant more to me than all the diamonds combined. I picked up the diamond necklace with trembling hands. Even in the dim light of my kitchen, it was extraordinary. Dozens of perfectly cut diamonds forming an intricate pattern that seemed to capture and multiply every available photon. The weight of it was substantial, the kind of jewelry that belonged in museums or on red carpets, not in the hands of an unemployed former caregiver sitting in a cramped apartment. The rings were equally stunning. The emerald was the size of my thumbnail, surrounded by smaller diamonds, in an Art Deco setting that screamed 1920s glamour. The ruby ring was more ornate, clearly older, with intricate gold work that spoke of master craftsmen from another era. The gold necklaces were more subtle but obviously valuable, with delicate workmanship and substantial weight that marked them as genuine heirlooms. I sat in my kitchen chair for what felt like hours, just holding these treasures and rereading Margaret's letter. She'd been planning this moment for years, probably since the early stages of her disease, when she could still think clearly about the future. She'd watched her 5 children prioritize their own lives over her care, and she'd chosen to reward the person who'd actually shown up. But Margaret's letter came with warnings that I couldn't ignore. Do it quietly. My children will contest this if they discover what you've inherited. She was absolutely right. If David and his siblings discovered what I'd inherited, there would be accusations of undue influence, legal battles that could drag on for years, ugly court proceedings that would paint me as a manipulative gold digger who'd preyed on a vulnerable elderly woman. I thought about Sarah's threat during the will reading. Maybe we should contest this, undue influence and all that. They'd dismissed the music box as worthless, but if they knew what it contained. I carefully returned everything to its hiding place and closed the music box. The melody seemed different now when I wound it up, less mournful and more like a promise, like hope set to music. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities I hadn't dared to consider in over a decade. For the first time since my divorce, I could think about my own future without the weight of caregiving responsibilities. I could go back to school, start my own business, buy a house with that garden Margaret had mentioned, travel to Europe like we'd always talked about doing together. But first, I needed to be incredibly smart about this. The next morning, I called in sick to the temp agency, where I'd been picking up occasional work since Margaret's funeral. Instead, I drove to the downtown library and spent 4 hours researching jewelry appraisers, auction houses, estate jewelry buyers, and investment strategies. Margaret had mentioned an appraisal from 2 years ago, but I needed current valuations, and more importantly, I needed to understand how to liquidate these assets without drawing the wrong kind of attention. I found 3 reputable jewelry appraisers in the city and made appointments for the following week, using my maiden name, Elena Santos, and claiming the pieces were inherited from a distant relative who'd lived in Europe. The story felt close enough to the truth that I could tell it convincingly while maintaining the privacy Margaret had insisted upon. Meanwhile, I continued my routine of looking for full-time work and living off my rapidly dwindling savings. To the outside world, I was still Elena Martinez, unemployed former caregiver, struggling to rebuild her life after 13 years of selfless service to an ungrateful family. The first appraiser, Mr. Goldstein, had been in business for 40 years. His shop was tucked between a vintage bookstore and a coffee roastery in the Arts District, the kind of place you'd walk past without noticing unless you knew what you were looking for. But inside, it was clear he was the real deal. the walls were lined with certificates from gemological institutes, awards from professional associations, and photographs of him examining pieces for major auction houses and museums. "These are extraordinary," he said, after examining the diamond necklace under his jeweler's loupe for several long minutes. "The craftsmanship suggests early 1900s, possibly European, maybe Austrian or Belgian. The diamonds are all natural, which is increasingly rare. High clarity, excellent cut quality for the period. Conservative estimate would be $800,000 for the necklace alone, but to the right collector, it could bring significantly more." My heart pounded so loudly I was certain he could hear it, but I kept my expression neutral and slightly bored, as if $1,000,000 jewelry was a common occurrence in my life. "And the rings?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. He examined the emerald ring next, taking even longer with his inspection. "Colombian emerald, probably 1920s Art Deco period. The setting is platinum, which was popular during that era. Beautiful stone, flawless quality, excellent color saturation. I'd estimate $180,000, possibly more in the current market." The ruby ring was older, he explained, probably 1890s Victorian era, with superior craftsmanship and genuine Burmese rubies that were becoming increasingly rare due to political restrictions on mining in Myanmar. "Another 120 sals, maybe $150,000 to the right buyer." He examined the gold necklaces last. "These are lovely pieces, 18-karat gold with hand-engraved details that indicate European manufacture, probably Italian. Together, perhaps $85,000. I thanked him politely and left, my head spinning with numbers that seemed too large to be real. Over $1.2 million, exactly as Margaret had indicated. The second appraiser, a woman who specialized in estate jewelry, was even more optimistic about values. The third, a gentleman who worked primarily with auction houses, suggested that provenance documentation could increase values even further. "Pieces like this don't come on the market often," he explained. "Collectors pay premium prices for jewelry with documented history, especially pieces that have remained in families for generations." I had that documentation, of course. Margaret's letter provided a clear chain of ownership going back to her great-grandmother. But using that information would require revealing my connection to the family, which could lead to exactly the kind of scrutiny Margaret had warned me about. That evening, I sat in my apartment with Margaret's letter spread out on my kitchen table, reading her advice again and again. "Use this gift wisely. Start the life you put on hold for me. For 13 years, my dreams had been small, practical things. A reliable car that didn't require monthly repairs. A vacation that lasted more than a long weekend. Maybe someday, a modest house with a small yard where I could grow tomatoes and herbs like Margaret had always encouraged me to do. But now I could dream bigger. I'd always been good with numbers, good with business planning and financial management. Before I'd married David, I'd been working toward my CPA certification with plans to eventually start my own accounting practice. I'd given up those plans when marriage and then caregiving took over my life. But the knowledge was still there, dormant, but intact. What if I started my own business? Not just any business, but something meaningful. Something that could help other families navigate exactly the kind of complex situations I'd witnessed over the past 13 years. The idea took shape slowly over the following days. I'd seen firsthand how families could be torn apart by caregiving responsibilities, by financial pressures, by assumptions about who owed what to whom. What if there was a better way? What if someone could help families plan for these challenges before crisis hit? Help them understand their legal obligations and options, organize their financial resources, facilitate difficult conversations before they became family-destroying arguments. I could create a practice that specialized in elder care, financial planning, and family mediation. Help people avoid the kind of resentment and dysfunction I'd witnessed in Margaret's children. Make sure that devoted caregivers understood their rights and options, that elderly people received the care they deserved, that families could navigate aging and inheritance without destroying their relationships. But first, I needed to be practical about my immediate situation. Following Margaret's advice about discretion, I decided to sell only one piece initially, the emerald ring. It was valuable enough to fund my new life, but not so distinctive that it would draw unwanted attention if Margaret's children somehow heard about high-value jewelry sales in the area. I contacted a private estate jewelry buyer in Chicago, someone Mr. Goldstein had recommended for discreet, high-value transactions. The buyer, Mrs. Chen, specialized in working with families who needed to liquidate inherited pieces quietly, often for estate tax purposes or family privacy concerns. "I understand completely," she said during our initial phone conversation. "Many families prefer to handle these transactions privately. I can meet you at my showroom, or if you prefer, I maintain a private office for more sensitive dealings." The sale went smoothly. Mrs. Chen was professional, discreet, and fair. After examining the emerald ring and verifying its authenticity through her own network of experts, she offered $165,000, slightly more than Mr. Goldstein's estimate. "It's a particularly fine example of the period," she explained as we completed the paperwork. "The setting is pristine, and Colombian emeralds of this quality are becoming increasingly scarce." The money was transferred electronically to a new bank account I'd opened under my maiden name in a different city, an account that had no connection to my previous life or to anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about sudden wealth. For the first time in over a decade, I had real financial freedom. I started small and careful. I rented a modest office space in a professional building downtown and began studying for my CPA exam, something I should have done 15 years earlier. I hired a lawyer, not Mr. Peterson, but a young woman with an excellent reputation who specialized in helping people establish small businesses, to help me structure my new venture properly. I bought professional clothes that fit me well and made me feel competent and confident for the first time in years. I joined the local Chamber of Commerce and began attending networking events, slowly building relationships with other professionals who might refer clients to my future practice. Most importantly, I began researching the elder care industry, studying the gaps between what families needed and what was currently available. I reached out to social workers, geriatricians, elder law attorneys, and care managers, learning about the challenges they saw most frequently. "The biggest problem is communication," explained Dr. Martinez, a geriatrician I'd met through a professional development seminar. "Families wait until there's a crisis to have important conversations. By then, emotions are running high, finances are strained, and everyone's making decisions based on guilt and fear rather than practical planning." That became the foundation of my business model, helping families have those difficult conversations before crisis hit, when people could still think clearly and make rational decisions based on love rather than emergency management. Within 6 months of Margaret's death, I'd passed my CPA exam and established Santos Family Financial Planning, a practice that specialized in helping families navigate the intersection of aging, caregiving, and inheritance. I offered services that ranged from basic financial organization to complex family mediation, always with the goal of preventing the kind of resentment and dysfunction I'd witnessed firsthand. Word of mouth spread quickly in our mid-sized city. Within a year, I had 23 regular clients and a waiting list for my services. "You saved our family," one client told me, after I'd helped them create a comprehensive care plan for their father's advancing Parkinson's disease. "We were about to tear each other apart over who was responsible for what. Now we have a plan that works for everyone, and more importantly, Dad feels like he still has some control over his own life." Another client, a woman about my age who'd been caring for her mother with dementia, cried during our final meeting. "I wish I'd found you 5 years ago," she said. "I felt so alone, so guilty for resenting the burden. You helped me understand that caring for Mom doesn't mean I have to disappear as a person." The work was deeply satisfying in a way my previous jobs had never been. I was using my skills and experience to help families avoid the kind of confusion, resentment, and heartbreak I'd lived through. I was making sure that devoted caregivers understood their legal rights and financial options, that elderly people received dignified care, that families could face these challenges together instead of being torn apart by them. Meanwhile, interesting news began filtering back to me through mutual acquaintances and social media about Margaret's children, including my ex-husband David. Michael, it turned out, had made some spectacularly poor investment decisions with his inheritance. Something about cryptocurrency and a business partner who disappeared with most of his liquid assets. The house, Margaret's house, was now on the market with a reduced price sign, and word around town was that he desperately needed the money to cover debts and avoid bankruptcy. Sarah had quit her high-powered marketing job to start a consulting business that was struggling to find clients in an increasingly competitive market. She'd moved back in with her ex-husband, a relationship everyone had thought was permanently over, because she could no longer afford her Denver apartment. Jennifer was dealing with her own financial crisis after her husband left, taking half their assets and leaving her to manage 3 children and college savings accounts that had somehow been depleted to pay for his failed restaurant venture. Thomas had burned through his trust fund within 18 months and was currently living in a studio apartment in Portland, working at a coffee shop and asking his siblings for loans they couldn't afford to give. And David's dental practice had hit rough times when his partner embezzled money and left him liable for significant debts. His marriage to Rebecca was reportedly strained by financial pressures, and they'd had to sell their house and move into a smaller place. The European vacation he'd inherited money for had been cancelled, the funds redirected to keeping his practice afloat. I felt no satisfaction in their misfortunes. These were Margaret's children, and she loved them deeply despite their flaws. But I couldn't help thinking about the contrast between their approach to sudden wealth and my own careful planning. They'd seen their inheritances as windfalls to be enjoyed immediately or invested aggressively for quick returns. I'd treated Margaret's gift as seed money for building something sustainable and meaningful. They'd made flashy purchases and risky investments based on optimism and greed. I'd built a business that could provide steady income and personal fulfillment for decades to come. Maybe that's what Margaret had seen in me all those years. Not just someone willing to sacrifice for others, but someone who understood the difference between having money and building wealth, between immediate gratification and long-term security. 2 years after that humiliating day in the lawyer's office, I received an unexpected call at my office. "Elena, it's Sarah. I got your number from directory assistance. I hope you don't mind me calling you at work." Her voice was different, softer, less confident than the sharp-edged woman who'd mocked me at the will reading. There was something almost hesitant about her tone that made me sit up straighter in my chair. "Of course not, Sarah. How are you doing?" There was a long pause, filled with the kind of silence that suggests someone is choosing their words very carefully. "Not great, actually. I was wondering, this might sound strange, but do you remember Mom ever mentioning other assets? Maybe things she didn't include in the will, or pieces of jewelry that might have been stored somewhere?" My heart started beating faster, but I kept my voice steady and professionally curious. "What do you mean?" "It's just, we've been going through her papers, and there are some financial records that don't quite add up. Some jewelry pieces we remember seeing over the years that aren't accounted for. Michael thinks maybe she sold them to pay for care expenses, but the math doesn't work out right. I'm sorry, Sarah, but your mother and I never discussed her finances beyond the basic household budget. She was always very private about money matters." Another long pause. "Right, of course. It's just, things have been difficult lately for all of us, and we wondered if maybe she'd mentioned something to you. You spent so much time with her those last years. We thought maybe she'd said something about family heirlooms or investments we didn't know about." The desperation in her voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't idle curiosity. This was a family in financial crisis, grasping for any possible solution to their problems. "I wish I could help," I said, and part of me genuinely meant it. Is everything okay with everyone? Sarah's laugh was bitter and exhausted. Oh, life. Sometimes I think about what you said that day at the lawyer's office about being family. I didn't understand it then, but I'm starting to. What do you mean? You stayed, Elena. When things got hard and messy and thankless, you stayed. We all had excuses for why we couldn't, but you just stayed. Even after David divorced you, even when we treated you like hired help instead of someone who loved Mom. Her voice was thick with emotion now. I keep thinking about those last years, about how we'd visit and everything would be perfect. The house was always clean, Mom was calm and well cared for. There were fresh flowers in every room and her favorite foods in the refrigerator. We never asked how that happened, we just assumed it would always be that way. Your mother was easy to love, I said softly, meaning it completely. Was she? Because it didn't feel easy to us. It felt overwhelming and complicated and sad. But maybe that's because we were trying to love the mother we remembered from our childhoods instead of the mother she had become. You loved her as she was, not as we wanted her to be. We talked for a few more minutes about Margaret's final years, about memories and regrets and the complicated nature of family love. When we hung up, I found myself crying for the third time since Margaret's death. Not from sadness this time, but from a complex mix of grief and gratitude, and something that might have been forgiveness. That night, I opened the music box again and reread Margaret's letter, her words seeming even more prophetic now. My children chose their paths long ago, and I chose mine when I decided to reward faithfulness over biology. She'd known exactly what would happen to them. She'd watched them make choices based on immediate gratification rather than long-term thinking, and she'd chosen a different legacy for her most precious treasures. I thought about calling Sarah back, about maybe finding a way to help them without revealing my secret. But Margaret's instructions had been crystal clear. Be smart, be careful, be happy. Getting involved in her children's financial problems wouldn't honor her wishes or help them learn the lessons they apparently needed to learn. Instead, I decided to expand my business in Margaret's honor. I hired 2 more associates and began offering workshops on elder care planning at community centers and senior facilities. I started a scholarship fund for women returning to work after extended caregiving periods, funded by the sale of the ruby ring. I quietly helped families who couldn't afford my services, using the foundation Margaret's gift had provided to do the kind of work she would have supported. 3 years after that day in the lawyer's office, I owned my own building, employed 12 people, and had helped over 400 families navigate the complexities of aging, care, and inheritance. I'd sold the diamond necklace to fund a non-profit organization that provided respite care for family caregivers, and I kept only the gold necklaces which I wore on special occasions as a reminder of Margaret's love and wisdom. I'd found love too, Dr. Martinez, the geriatrician I'd met during my early networking days, had become first a professional colleague, then a friend, and eventually something much deeper. He understood my history, respected the choices I'd made, and supported the work I was building. We'd married in a small ceremony at the botanical gardens Margaret had always loved, with Emma as my maid of honor and a handful of close friends as witnesses. Margaret would have loved him, Emma had said as we watched Roberto speak with some of my elderly clients at the reception. Look how gently he talks to Mrs. Peterson. That's a man who understands what you've been through. I never told Roberto about the jewelry. That secret belonged to Margaret and me alone. But he knew that my business had grown more quickly than most new ventures, and he accepted my explanation that I'd received a small inheritance that had provided crucial startup capital. 5 years after Margaret's death, I received a wedding invitation that surprised me completely. It was from David, and it was addressed to Elena and Roberto Santos. Dear Elena, I know this might seem strange, reaching out after all these years, but Rebecca and I are getting married again. We divorced 2 years ago when everything fell apart. but we've been working on rebuilding both our relationship and our lives. I wanted you to know that part of that rebuilding involved me finally understanding some things I should have figured out a long time ago. I was wrong about so many things, Elena. I was wrong to let you carry the burden of Mom's care alone. I was wrong to sit silently while my siblings mocked you at the will reading. I was wrong to prioritize my comfort over doing what was right. You loved my mother better than any of her biological children did, and she knew it. That music box she left you. I remember her winding it up during some of her worst days, when nothing else could calm her down. She told me once that it reminded her of being safe, of being loved unconditionally. I think she wanted you to have that feeling. I hope you found happiness, Elena. I hope you've built the life you always deserved. With respect and belated gratitude, David, I RSVP'd yes, curious to see how time had changed all of us. The wedding was small and subdued, nothing like the lavish affair David and Rebecca had thrown the first time around. Michael was there, looking older and more subdued than I remembered. Sarah came alone, her usual sharp confidence replaced by something quieter and more thoughtful. Jennifer brought her oldest son, now in college, and seemed genuinely happy despite the financial struggles she'd endured. Thomas looked healthier than he had in years, apparently having found some stability in Portland. They were all polite to me, even warm, but there was an underlying awkwardness that suggested they still didn't quite understand my relationship to their family history. After the ceremony, David approached Roberto and me at the reception. "Elena," he said, and I could see the genuine emotion in his eyes. "Thank you for coming, and thank you for everything. I know I never said it properly, but what you did for Mom, the way you cared for her, it was extraordinary." "She was extraordinary," I replied, meaning it. "I was lucky to have those years with her." "We were the lucky ones," he said quietly. "We just didn't realize it at the time. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm working in my office, I wind up the music box and let the melody play while I review client files or plan new programs. The tune still makes me think of Margaret, but now it also reminds me of her final lesson. That true wealth isn't about what you inherit, but what you do with what you've been given. The music box sits on my desk now, no longer hiding secrets, but serving as a daily reminder that love, patience, and wisdom are the only inheritances that truly matter. Margaret's jewelry gave me financial freedom, but her letter gave me something much more valuable: the knowledge that 13 years of sacrifice had been seen, appreciated, and rewarded by someone who understood its true worth. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that recognition comes with diamonds attached.